Evil heart or mentally ill? A South Carolina jury is going to decide whether Timothy Jones is guilty or guilty by reason of insanity for killing his 5 children. Let's talk about it. Good day, Crime Talk aficionados. This is Scott Reisch of CrimeTalk. Today I want to talk about the case of Timothy Jones. He's a 37-year-old man on trial in Lexington, South Carolina for the death of his 5 children. This has the potential to be such an interesting case and verdict, and that's why we want to talk about it. So Timothy Jones, for those who do not know, is charged with 5 counts of murder in the 2014 death of his children. His defense is running an affirmative defense. An affirmative defense is saying, yes, I committed the crime, but I have an excuse which makes it legally justifiable. Now, this is a little bit different because you're not saying it's justifiable to kill my children, but it is pleading guilty by reason of insanity, basically saying I am guilty of doing the act, but I didn't have the requisite mental intent, all right? So Timothy Jones is 37 years old, and he's charged with 5 counts of murder in the 2014 deaths of his children. His defense has conceded that he killed the children, but he is not guilty by reason of insanity. The defense is stating that Mr. Jones has a mental defect or disease that basically does not allow him to appreciate right from wrong. In this particular case, it is schizophrenia. Now, the facts of this particular case are particularly horrendous given the fact that children are the victims and the father is the one accused of committing the crime. So Mr. Jones had a contentious breakup with his wife. He is a college-educated computer software engineer. And ultimately, through the divorce process, he ends up with all 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls. Prosecutors alleged that Mr. Jones killed his son, Nathan, who is 6, after the boy broke an electrical outlet in the mobile home on August 28th of 2014. Jones went on to strangle his oldest child, his 8-year-old daughter, Mariah, and his 7-year-old son, Elias. It's alleged that he strangled these children with his hands. According to the prosecutors and statements in the case, Mariah's last words were, "Daddy, I love you." Timothy Jones then went and wrapped a belt around the neck of his 2-year-old son, Gabriel, and his youngest child, Abigail, who was 1 year old at the time. Timothy Jones is then alleged to have stuffed the bodies in garbage bags. He loaded the remains into his Cadillac Escalade and drove for days through 4 states, sleeping in the SUV with the bodies in the back. Timothy Jones is then alleged to have dumped his children's badly decomposing bodies in a desolate part of Alabama. On September 6th of 2014, he was arrested in Smith County, Mississippi at a police checkpoint after an officer detected what he described on the stand as, quote, the smell of death coming from Jones's SUV. Blood, maggots, and synthetic marijuana were also found in the SUV. During the police questioning, Jones admitted to killing his children, but claimed he did so in a preemptive self-defense before they could chop him up and feed him to the dogs, according to the affidavit for arrest warrant for Mr. Jones. In his confession to the police, the prosecutors played for the jurors. Jones had admitted he lost his temper when Nathan broke the outlet. Jones said he found his son deceased several hours later, he said in the confession. The voices started kicking in, saying, "You better do something, you're expletive, Tim," he said in his confession. And curiously enough, he had taken the children to the beach and to Disney World at some point before the murders, prosecutors alleged. The mother of the children testified at the trial that when she'd married Jones after they graduated from college, he had a good job and he was smart and responsible. she states that his demeanor towards her changed dramatically after they wed. She stated that it was basically her job to take care of the children and to keep them out of his way. Jones was allegedly livid when his now ex-wife had an affair with a 19-year-old neighbor, according to the affidavit for divorce. Following this contentious split, Jones' ex-wife said that she handed over custody of the children because he could support them on his $80,000 a year job, and she simply could not. Now, the defense is alleging that Mr. Jones suffers from an undiagnosed schizophrenia diagnosis, which is the basis for their defense of not guilty by reason of insanity. So if one is found not guilty by reason of insanity, they simply do not permit the defendant to walk out the door with their attorney. They don't get to go home. They get to go to the state mental hospital and are basically held there after treatment and reviews done by the court to see if they are making any progress and if they will ever be able to be released. One convicted of capital murder would more than likely remain in the mental hospital for the rest of his days. The defense obviously has a motive to try and take this out of a death penalty case, and obviously the cleanest way to do that in this particular circumstances would be to have a defense, which is basically not guilty by insanity, and he would remain in the mental institution for the rest of his days. I'm not familiar with the case as it relates to any plea negotiations, but clearly killing your 5 children under the law, the aggravating factors of most death penalty statutes, this clearly fits the aggravating factors, and we can talk about that in an upcoming episode. The defense also has to prove by a preponderance of the evidence that this mental illness or defect exists. Now, that's a very low standard of proof. It doesn't lower it for the prosecution. The prosecution still has to prove that the murders occurred by proof by reasonable doubt, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Not really an issue here because the defense has all but conceded that. But by a preponderance of the evidence, and the standard of a preponderance of the evidence is simply more likely than not that this mental disease or defect exists, not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense is going to bring in expert testimony, which they've done already, through psychiatrists who are going to explain that Mr. Jones suffered from an undiagnosed schizophrenia disorder and that this was exacerbated by the use of drugs. It's a question of fact for the jury to decide whether they believe this defense or not. This is not as it relates to sentencing at all. The defense will bring in their experts, and more than likely in the rebuttal case in chief, the prosecution will bring in people to rebut either through their own experts or through people that have observed Mr. Jones during the pendency of this case to say that he acted normally, that there was no way that he was suffering from this mental disease or defect. In South Carolina, Section 17-24-10, affirmative defenses, it states, it is an affirmative defense to a prosecution for a crime that at the time of the commission of the act constituting the offense, the defendant, as a result of mental disease or defect, lacked the capacity to distinguish moral or legal right from moral or legal wrong, or to recognize the particular act charged as morally or legally wrong. The defendant has the burden of proving the defense of insanity by a preponderance of the evidence. All right? Now, the South Carolina statute also states that evidence of a mental disease or defect that is manifested only by repeated criminal or other antisocial conduct is not sufficient to establish the defense of insanity. So in this particular case, the jury would have to decide in the guilt phase of the trial of whether Mr. Jones is guilty, not guilty by reason of insanity, or guilty but mentally ill. Now, the defense is going with not guilty by reason of insanity. The defense has to prove that Mr. Jones has a mental disease or defect that makes him basically not willing to appreciate right from wrong. The defense is trying to establish through experts that Mr. Jones has schizophrenia, and that basically through the schizophrenia, he heard the voices telling him to basically take the children out because they were going to get rid of him. All right? That is the defense. Now, let's just say that the jury says, yes, Mr. Jones has this mental defect, not guilty by reason of insanity. What does that really mean? Does that mean Mr. Jones walks out of the courtroom with his attorneys and is on his merry way? Absolutely not. What that means is he'll then be sent to the mental hospital there in South Carolina. They will do an evaluation for him. They will give the report to the court, and they will have subsequent hearings depending on what kind of treatment Mr. Jones would need to be restored to mental capacity. It doesn't mean that he's going to get out of prison. He can be held basically indefinitely, given the nature of these particular charges, so that he does not pose a risk to himself or to others in the community. For those of you who are old enough to remember, this is similar to the case of John Hinckley Jr. He was the man who attempted to kill Ronald Reagan by shooting him several times, but he was found not guilty by reason of insanity. He didn't just get to go home. He got to go off to the mental hospital whereby he has been treated. And over the course of the last 30 plus years, he's been able to go home, have weekend visits, etc. And now the doctors are finally starting to say that he can go free. But people are still upset and objecting to that. But that's up for the court to decide. Same thing here for Mr. Jones if he is convicted. Okay, understand, he has conceded that he killed the children. The state of South Carolina is seeking the death penalty. You're conceding what you did. It's an affirmative defense saying, I did the act, but I shouldn't be held legally responsible for that in this particular case. And then he runs the risk. The jury could say, well, he conceded that he did this, and if the jury doesn't buy his not guilty by reason of insanity defense, obviously he's going to be found not guilty and has a very good chance of being sentenced to death. It should be very dramatic when a verdict is reached. There are no winners in this case. There are no losers. The mother has lost 5 children. Even the defendant has lost 5 children by his own hands. You want to almost hope that he does have a mental disease or defect, because you really just cannot appreciate somebody that could do that to their children. You almost hope that there's something there to explain why somebody could kill their 5 children by strangulation. And the most important news is that if you were one of the 10 people who emailed me for a mug last week, they have gone out in the mail today. Hope you enjoy it. We will be following this case in the days and weeks ahead, and if we get to a sentencing phase, we'll be following that as well. I appreciate you watching Crime Talk. If you like the channel, please subscribe. Please hit the little like button. Please hit the bell if you would like notifications of when we go live or when new content is put out. And please leave a comment. Leave a comment about this case. Leave us a comment about other cases you would like us to follow. Have a great day, and thanks for watching Crime Talk.